Sarah Martinez adjusted her blazer for the third time in 10 minutes. The mahogany conference table stretched before her like an endless battlefield, surrounded by men in expensive suits who looked at her with barely concealed skepticism. At 28, she was the youngest person ever nominated for the position of Chief Technology Officer at Henderson Industries, a manufacturing giant with a century-long legacy. The morning sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor boardroom, casting long shadows across polished surfaces. Sarah had fought tooth and nail to reach this moment. Her engineering degree from MIT, her innovative patents in sustainable manufacturing, her track record of turning failing tech departments into profit centers, none of it seemed to matter to the 12 board members who would decide her fate. Chairman Robert Henderson III, great-grandson of the company founder, sat at the head of the table. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. To his right sat Margaret Whitfield, the only other woman in the room, though her icy stare suggested no sisterly support would come from that direction. "Ms. Martinez," Henderson began, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older traditions, "your qualifications are impressive for someone of your background." The pause before background hit like a physical blow. Sarah had heard variations of this her entire career. Too young. Too diverse. Too ambitious. The unspoken message was always the same: she didn't belong in their world of inherited wealth and generational privilege. However, Henderson continued, "We have concerns about your ability to fit into our corporate culture." Henderson Industries has operated successfully for over 100 years using proven methods and trusted leadership. Sarah's hands remained steady on the table, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed her responses, anticipated their objections. But, sitting here, surrounded by portraits of deceased white men who had built this empire on the backs of workers like her grandfather, she felt the weight of representation crushing down on her shoulders. "I understand your concerns," Sarah replied, her voice clear and professional. "But, innovation doesn't come from maintaining the status quo. Your third-quarter reports show declining efficiency in manufacturing, increased waste costs, and technological lag behind competitors. My proposals address each of these issues with measurable solutions." Board member James Rothschild leaned forward, his jowls trembling slightly as he spoke. "Young lady, we've been running this company since before you were born. We don't need lectures on efficiency from someone who learned everything from textbooks." The condescension dripped from every word. Sarah felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. She thought about her parents, immigrants who had worked double shifts in factories to pay for her education. She thought about her younger sister, watching from home, believing that hard work and intelligence could overcome any barrier. "With respect, Mr. Rothschild," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength, "those textbooks contained innovations that have revolutionized manufacturing globally. While Henderson Industries has been maintaining the status quo, competitors have implemented the exact systems I'm proposing. Your market share has dropped 18% in 2 years." A murmur rippled through the room. Henderson's expression darkened. "Ms. Martinez, we appreciate your enthusiasm. However, leadership requires more than technical knowledge. It requires understanding of tradition, respect for established hierarchies, and the ability to work within existing frameworks." Margaret Whitfield finally spoke, her voice sharp as broken glass. "What Mr. Henderson is trying to say, dear, is that this position requires someone who understands how things work around here. Someone who won't rock the boat unnecessarily." The dismissal was clear. Sarah had spent years navigating corporate politics, learning to soften her edges, to make her ambitions more palatable to rooms full of men who saw her as an intruder. But, sitting here, listening to their coded language, she realized that no amount of accommodation would ever be enough. "I see," Sarah said quietly. "And, by how things work around here, you mean maintaining systems that prioritize comfort over competence? Tradition over innovation? Familiarity over results?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Henderson's face flushed red above his starched collar. "Ms. Martinez, I think we've heard enough." But Sarah wasn't finished. Years of swallowed words, of biting her tongue, of making herself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed for her, suddenly erupted. Have you looked at your employee satisfaction surveys? Your retention rates in technical positions? Your recruitment difficulties in attracting top talent? Because the data suggests that how things work around here isn't working at all. Board member David Chen, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As the newest member and the only person of color besides Sarah, he understood the delicate balance she was trying to maintain. His own appointment had been met with similar resistance, though his family's wealth and connections had smoothed some of the rougher edges. The financial projections in your proposal are certainly interesting, Chen offered diplomatically, clearly trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Sarah seized the opening. The projected savings in the first year alone would exceed $15 million. Implementation of automated quality control systems would reduce waste by 30% while improving product consistency. The sustainable manufacturing initiatives would position Henderson Industries as an industry leader in environmental responsibility, opening new markets and improving public perception. Numbers on paper, Rothschild dismissed with a wave of his hand. What matters is leadership presence, the ability to command respect from seasoned executives and factory workers alike. Can you honestly say you possess those qualities? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah understood what he was really asking. Could someone who looked like her, someone from her background, someone without the right pedigree or connections, truly lead in their world? It was the same question that had followed her throughout her career, whispered in hallways and unspoken in performance reviews. She thought about the teams she had already led, the respect she had earned through competence rather than inheritance. She thought about the factory workers who would listen to her ideas because they saw results, not because of her last name or her alma mater's reputation. She thought about the engineers who had followed her leadership because she understood their challenges, not because she reminded them of their fathers or grandfathers. Mr. Rothschild, Sarah said, her voice steady with conviction, respect isn't inherited. It's earned. And I've earned mine through results, innovation, and the ability to see solutions where others see only problems. Henderson drummed his fingers on the table, a sound like rain on a roof. Ms. Martinez, we appreciate your time, but I think it's clear that this position isn't the right fit for your particular skill set. The rejection was polite but absolute. Sarah felt the familiar sting of exclusion, the door slamming shut once again. She gathered her materials with practiced dignity, her movements precise and controlled despite the storm raging inside her chest. Before I leave, Sarah said, reaching into her briefcase, I'd like to share something that might interest you. She pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents and photographs. Henderson's eyebrows raised slightly at the unexpected development. During my preparation for this position, I conducted extensive research into Henderson Industries' operations, history, and competitive position. What I found was illuminating. Sarah opened the folder and placed a photograph on the table. It showed Henderson Industries' main manufacturing plant, but the image was grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. This was taken last month at your primary facility. The board members leaned forward, confusion evident on their faces. The photograph showed workers in protective gear handling what appeared to be barrels of industrial chemicals, but something about the scene looked wrong. The workers weren't wearing proper hazmat suits, and the barrels appeared to be leaking onto the factory floor. I don't understand the relevance, Henderson said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Sarah placed another document on the table. EPA inspection reports from the past 6 months. Henderson Industries has been cited for 17 environmental violations, including improper disposal of hazardous waste and failure to maintain safety standards in chemical handling. The room fell silent. Margaret Whitfield's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. Chen leaned back in his chair, his face pale. These violations, Sarah continued, have been systematically covered up through a combination of falsified inspection reports, bribed officials, and strategic timing of cleanup efforts. The cost of these cover-ups has been approximately $3 million over the past year alone. Henderson's face had gone from red to ashen. Where did you get this information? The same place anyone could get it, Sarah replied calmly. Public records, employee testimonies, and basic investigative work. The kind of due diligence that any responsible board member should conduct regularly. She placed another set of documents on the table. Worker compensation claims suppressed through legal intimidation. Medical bills for employees exposed to toxic chemicals, paid quietly to avoid public scrutiny. Safety training programs that exist only on paper while workers continue to be exposed to dangerous conditions daily. Rothschild's hands shook as he reached for the documents. This can't be accurate. It's not only accurate, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength with each revelation, it's getting worse. The cost of maintaining these cover-ups is increasing exponentially. More importantly, people are getting hurt. Workers who trusted this company to protect their safety are developing respiratory problems, skin conditions, and other health issues that will eventually result in lawsuits that make current cover-up costs look like pocket change. The board members exchanged horrified glances. Henderson tried to regain control of the situation. Even if these allegations were true, which I'm not admitting, what does this have to do with your qualifications for the CTO position? Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Everything. Because the person currently in charge of overseeing these operations, the person whose systems and procedures have allowed these violations to continue unchecked, is the same person you were planning to promote to replace me in this position. She placed a final document on the table. Thomas Mitchell, your current acting CTO and the board's preferred candidate for this position, has been signing off on false environmental compliance reports for 18 months. His signature is on every cover-up, every falsified document, every decision that prioritized short-term profits over worker safety and environmental responsibility. The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Thomas Mitchell was Henderson's nephew, a legacy hire whose appointment had been seen as a foregone conclusion. His technical qualifications were minimal, but his family connections and his willingness to maintain existing systems had made him the obvious choice in the board's collective mind. You're saying Tom is responsible for this? Henderson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that the systems and leadership currently in place have created a culture where these violations are not only possible but inevitable, Sarah replied. The question you need to ask yourselves is whether you want to continue down this path, hoping that luck and cover-ups will protect you indefinitely, or whether you want real change that addresses these problems at their source. Margaret Whitfield found her voice. Are you threatening us? I'm offering you a solution, Sarah said simply. The choice is yours. The room fell into stunned silence. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware that 42 floors above, a young woman who supposedly didn't belong was reshaping the future of a century-old company with nothing more than truth, courage, and a manila folder full of evidence. Henderson stared at the documents spread across the table, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified had just demonstrated investigative skills, strategic thinking, and moral courage that none of his hand-picked board members possessed. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. Sarah closed the folder and met his gaze steadily. I'm proposing that Henderson Industries has a choice. You can continue operating as you always have, dealing with problems through cover-ups and hoping that your luck holds out. Or you can embrace real change, implement systems that prevent these problems from occurring, and build a company that your great-grandfather would actually be proud of. The weight of her words settled over the room like dust after an explosion. For the first time in her career, Sarah held all the cards. The question was whether she would choose to play them with mercy or with justice. The morning sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the boardroom table. Everything had changed in the space of 30 minutes, and everyone in the room knew that there was no going back to the way things were before. Sarah Martinez might not have belonged in their world by their old definitions, but she had just proven that their old definitions were not only wrong but dangerously obsolete. The future of Henderson Industries now hung in the balance, and the woman they had tried to dismiss held the scales in her hands. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah watched the board members process the magnitude of what she had just revealed. Henderson's hands trembled as he flipped through the environmental violation reports. Margaret Whitfield stared at the photographs with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. David Chen was the first to speak. "How long have you known about this?" 3 weeks, Sarah replied honestly. "I discovered the first inconsistencies while reviewing financial reports in preparation for this meeting. The environmental compliance budget seemed unusually high for a company with Henderson Industries' reported safety record." She had actually stumbled upon the cover-up by accident. Late one night in the company's technical library, researching manufacturing efficiency protocols, she had noticed a filing cabinet that hadn't been properly locked. Inside, she found documents that didn't match the official reports filed with the EPA. The discrepancies were small at first: dates that didn't align, chemical usage reports that conflicted with purchase orders, but they formed a pattern that led her deeper into the company's hidden operations. "So you've been spying on us," Rothschild accused, his face flushed with indignation. "I've been doing my homework," Sarah corrected. "The same due diligence that any responsible executive should perform before accepting a leadership position. The fact that you consider basic research to be espionage says more about your expectations than my methods." Henderson finally looked up from the documents. "These violations, how bad are they really?" Sarah had anticipated this question. She pulled out her laptop and opened a presentation she had prepared but hoped never to use. "The violations fall into 3 categories: immediate health risks, long-term environmental damage, and regulatory non-compliance. Let me show you what each one means in practical terms." The first slide displayed medical records from Henderson Industries' own occupational health database. Names were redacted, but the symptoms were clear: respiratory problems, skin rashes, neurological issues, and blood abnormalities consistent with chemical exposure. "These are your employees," Sarah said quietly. 47 cases in the past 18 months. The company clinic has been diagnosing these as unrelated individual health issues, but the pattern is unmistakable when you look at the data collectively. Margaret Whitfield gasped audibly when she saw the charts. 47 people? 47 documented cases, Sarah clarified. The actual number is likely much higher, since many workers avoid the company clinic out of fear that health complaints could affect their employment. She advanced to the next slide, showing satellite imagery of the Henderson Industries plant and surrounding area. The environmental impact extends beyond your immediate workforce. Groundwater contamination from improper chemical disposal has affected drinking water supplies in 3 neighboring communities. Soil samples show heavy metal concentrations that exceed safe levels by a factor of 10 in some areas. Board member Harrison Clark, who had inherited his position along with his family's stock holdings, leaned forward with a confused expression. "But our environmental compliance officer assured us that all procedures were being followed properly." "Your environmental compliance officer reports to Thomas Mitchell," Sarah replied. "And Mitchell's primary concern has been maintaining production schedules and minimizing costs, not ensuring actual compliance. The reports you've been receiving are essentially works of fiction." She clicked to the next slide, displaying a flowchart that showed how information moved through the company's hierarchy. The system is designed to prevent bad news from reaching the board level. Mitchell created a buffer of middle managers whose job is to solve problems quietly rather than report them accurately. Environmental violations become minor procedural adjustments. Worker health complaints become individual medical issues. Regulatory inspections become routine compliance checks that pass because the inspectors are either looking at falsified records or being compensated for their cooperation. Henderson's face had gone completely white. "You're saying we've been deliberately kept in the dark?" "I'm saying you've created a system that prioritizes comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth," Sarah replied. "And that system has put your company, your workers, and your community at serious risk." The room fell silent again as board members absorbed the implications. Sarah waited, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone connected to Henderson Industries. Chen cleared his throat. "What kind of legal exposure are we looking at?" Sarah had spent considerable time researching this exact question. Current EPA fines for these violations could reach $50 million if fully prosecuted. Criminal charges for willful environmental crimes could result in jail time for executives who knowingly participated in or covered up the violations. Civil lawsuits from affected workers and community members could easily exceed $100 million in damages. She paused to let those numbers sink in. But the financial cost is actually the smallest part of the problem. The real issue is ongoing harm. Every day these violations continue, more people are exposed to dangerous chemicals, more environmental damage occurs, and the eventual consequences become more severe. Rothschild struggled to his feet, his face red with anger and confusion. This is impossible. Tom Mitchell is family. He would never deliberately put the company at risk. Mr. Rothschild, Sarah said gently, I don't think Mitchell set out to create this situation. I think he found himself managing problems that he wasn't equipped to solve, and he chose short-term fixes over long-term solutions. Each individual decision probably seemed reasonable at the time. But, collectively, those decisions have created a crisis that threatens the company's survival. She had actually spent time studying Mitchell's background and psychology. He was a competent engineer who had been promoted beyond his capabilities and, then, pressured to produce results without the resources or authority to address systemic problems. His solution had been to make problems disappear on paper rather than solve them in reality, an approach that worked until someone like Sarah came along with the skills and motivation to look beneath the surface. Henderson spoke slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. If this information becomes public, Henderson Industries will cease to exist as a viable company, Sarah finished. The regulatory penalties, legal costs, and reputation damage would be insurmountable. Your stock price would collapse, your insurance would be cancelled, and your ability to secure contracts would evaporate. The company that your great-grandfather built would be destroyed within months. The brutality of her assessment hit the room like a physical blow. These men and women had inherited or earned positions based on the assumption that Henderson Industries was a stable, profitable enterprise with a secure future. The revelation that their foundation was built on criminal negligence and environmental destruction shattered everything they thought they knew about their company and their own positions within it. Margaret Whitfield finally broke the silence. What do you want from us? It was the question Sarah had been waiting for, but also the one she dreaded most. Because what she wanted would require these people to admit that everything they believed about themselves and their company was wrong. It would require them to embrace changes that threatened their power, their comfort, and their sense of identity. I want you to save this company, Sarah said simply. Not just from legal consequences, but from the culture that created this situation in the first place. I want you to build systems that prevent problems instead of hiding them. I want you to create an organization that your employees can trust and your community can be proud of. She advanced to her final slide, which showed a comprehensive reform proposal she had spent weeks developing. This is what real change looks like. Immediate cessation of all illegal activities, voluntary disclosure to regulatory authorities, comprehensive health screening for all affected employees, environmental remediation of contaminated sites, and implementation of transparent monitoring systems that make future violations impossible. Henderson stared at the proposal with the expression of a man watching his own execution. The cost? The initial cost will be approximately $30 million, Sarah acknowledged. But the alternative is the complete destruction of the company and potential criminal prosecution for everyone in this room who had knowledge of these activities and failed to act. She had spent considerable time calculating these figures, working with environmental consultants and legal experts to develop realistic cost estimates. The $30 million was a significant expense, but it was manageable for a company of Henderson Industries' size, especially compared to the hundreds of millions they would face if the violations continued and were eventually exposed through other channels. And you think you're the person to oversee this transformation? Margaret Whitfield asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. I think I'm the person who uncovered these problems while everyone else was either ignoring them or actively hiding them, Sarah replied. I think I'm the person who has the technical expertise to implement solutions and the moral courage to ensure they're actually followed. And I think I'm the person who has nothing to lose by telling the truth, which makes me the most dangerous person in the room if you choose to continue covering up these violations. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Sarah held evidence that could destroy them all, and they had no way of knowing what other information she might have discovered or what measures she might have taken to protect herself. Chen leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. You're saying that if we don't give you the CTO position and full authority to implement these changes, you'll expose everything? I'm saying that these violations are going to be exposed eventually, whether I expose them or someone else does, Sarah corrected. Government agencies are getting better at detecting environmental crimes. Investigative journalists are paying more attention to corporate malfeasance. Workers are becoming more willing to report safety violations. The cover-up has a limited lifespan regardless of what happens to me. She paused, letting her words sink in. What I'm offering you is the opportunity to control how this story ends. You can be the company that voluntarily came forward and fixed its problems, or you can be the company that got caught and destroyed in the resulting scandal. But, either way, the current situation is unsustainable. Henderson drummed his fingers on the table again, the sound now seeming less like authority and more like nervous energy. Even if we agreed to your proposal, how do we know you can actually deliver these results? Environmental remediation is complex, expensive work. Regulatory compliance requires specialized knowledge. Corporate culture change is notoriously difficult. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room, and this time there was genuine warmth in the expression. Mr. Henderson, those are exactly the kinds of challenges I've been solving my entire career. The difference is that now you need me to solve them for you, instead of preventing me from solving them for you. She opened her briefcase again and pulled out another folder, this one filled with project reports, testimonials, and performance evaluations from her previous positions. Environmental cleanup at Morrison Chemical Company, 6 months ahead of schedule, $12 million under budget, 0 regulatory violations in the 3 years since completion. Safety system overhaul at Pacific Manufacturing, 60% reduction in workplace injuries, 40% improvement in employee satisfaction, 15% increase in productivity. The credentials were impressive, but, more importantly, they were relevant. Sarah had specifically chosen career moves that would give her experience with exactly the kinds of problems Henderson Industries was now facing. She had prepared for this moment without knowing it would come, building skills and expertise that made her uniquely qualified to solve problems that most executives would find overwhelming. The question isn't whether I can fix these problems, Sarah continued. The question is whether you trust me enough to let me fix them, and whether you have the courage to support the changes that will be necessary to prevent them from happening again. Rothschild slumped in his chair, looking every one of his 73 years. This isn't the company I thought I was serving. No, Sarah agreed. It's not. But, it could be the company you choose to create going forward. The weight of decision hung heavy in the air. Sarah had laid out the evidence, explained the consequences, and offered a solution. Now she could only wait while 12 people decided whether to trust their future to someone they had dismissed as unqualified just an hour earlier. Outside the windows, the city continued its daily business, unaware that the future of thousands of jobs, the health of multiple communities, and the survival of a century-old company hung in the balance of a conversation happening 42 floors above the street. The file folder sat closed on the table between them, its contents having already changed everything. The only question now was whether the change would come through voluntary transformation or involuntary destruction. The minutes ticked by in oppressive silence. Sarah could hear the subtle sounds of the building around them, the hum of air conditioning, the distant ping of elevators, the muffled conversations from adjacent conference rooms where other meetings continued their normal course, blissfully unaware of the corporate earthquake happening just down the hall. Henderson stood and walked to the windows, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the city below. The empire his family had built stretched out before him, represented by the manufacturing facilities, distribution centers, and office buildings that dotted the metropolitan landscape. Everything he had inherited, everything he had worked to preserve, now hung in the balance because of information contained in a manila folder carried by a woman his board had planned to dismiss. $30 million, he said quietly, not turning around. That's assuming everything goes according to plan. No cost overruns, no unexpected complications, no additional violations discovered during the cleanup process.
Sarah had anticipated this concern.
The 30 million is a conservative estimate based on worst-case scenarios for the violations we've already identified. I've built in contingencies for additional discoveries and potential cost overruns.
The actual expense could be lower if we move quickly and efficiently.
Margaret Whitfield shuffled through the documents again, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she processed the medical records.
These workers, some of them have been with the company for decades. They trusted us to keep them safe.
They still do, Sarah replied. Which is why we have an opportunity to rebuild the trust through action rather than lose it entirely through continued deception. The moral dimension of the crisis was perhaps the most difficult for the board members to process. These were people who saw themselves as pillars of the community, supporters of charitable causes, respected leaders in business and society. The revelation that their company had been systematically poisoning its own workers and surrounding neighborhoods challenged their fundamental understanding of themselves and their roles.
David Chen had been quietly reviewing the regulatory compliance proposal on his tablet. The voluntary disclosure to the EPA that could trigger a criminal investigation. Federal prosecutors don't always distinguish between board members who knew about violations and those who were kept in ignorance. Sarah nodded grimly. It's a risk.
But it's a manageable risk if we approach it correctly. Voluntary disclosure, combined with immediate corrective action and full cooperation with investigators, typically results in reduced penalties and corporate rather than individual prosecution. The alternative, waiting for the violations to be discovered through other channels, almost guarantees criminal charges for senior executives.
She had consulted with several attorneys who specialized in environmental crime, though she couldn't reveal that consultation without compromising attorney-client privilege.
The legal landscape was complex, but the fundamental calculation was clear: proactive disclosure and remediation offered the best chance of avoiding prison time for everyone in the room. Harrison Clark, who had been silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up.
What about Tom Mitchell? If we accept your proposal, what happens to him? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall.
Thomas Mitchell was more than just an employee, he was family, a legacy hire whose future had been assumed and planned for since childhood. His involvement in the cover-up made him a liability, but his family connections made him difficult to sacrifice.
Mitchell will need to resign immediately, Sarah said without hesitation.
His signature is on too many false documents, his involvement in the cover-up is too extensive, and his continued presence would undermine any claims of genuine reform. More importantly, as long as he remains in a position of authority, the systems and culture that created these problems will persist. Henderson turned from the window, his face showing the strain of impossible choices.
Tom is my sister's son.
He has a family, a mortgage, children in college.
You're asking me to destroy his life. I'm asking you to save your company, Sarah corrected.
Mitchell destroyed his own life the moment he chose to falsify the first environmental report. The question now is whether you're going to let his poor decisions destroy everyone else's life as well. The brutality of the assessment was necessary, but Sarah could see its impact on Henderson's face. Family loyalty was deeply ingrained in companies like Henderson Industries, where positions were often inherited and business relationships spanned generations. Asking Henderson to sacrifice his nephew for the greater good of the company was asking him to violate one of his most fundamental values. There might be alternatives, Chen suggested diplomatically.
Mitchell could take a leave of absence while the situation is investigated.
If he cooperates with cleanup efforts and provides full testimony about how the violations occurred, prosecutors might be willing to negotiate reduced charges.
Sarah shook her head.
Prosecutors don't negotiate with people who are still in positions of power. Mitchell's resignation needs to be immediate and permanent. He can cooperate with investigations as a private citizen, but he cannot remain as an employee of Henderson Industries if you want regulatory agencies and the public to believe that real change is occurring. The conversation had shifted from whether to implement Sarah's proposal to how to implement it. The change was subtle but significant. The board was no longer debating whether she was right, but rather how to manage the consequences of accepting that she was right. Margaret Whitfield cleared her throat.
If we give you the authority you're requesting, what guarantee do we have that you won't simply use this information to blackmail us indefinitely? How do we know this isn't just an elaborate scheme to gain power through intimidation?
It was a fair question, and one that Sarah had expected.
Because blackmail only works if the information remains secret. My proposal involves voluntary disclosure of everything to regulatory authorities.
Once that disclosure happens, I no longer have leverage over you, but you no longer need leverage over me, because we'll all be committed to the same path forward.
She paused, considering how much of her personal motivation to reveal.
More importantly, Mrs. Whitfield, I don't want to spend my career managing a company through fear and coercion.
I want to build something better.
The leverage I have right now is temporary. What matters is whether I can prove that my approach works better than the approach that created this crisis in the first place.
Rothschild struggled to his feet again, using the table for support.
Even if we agreed to all of this, the stockholders would revolt. Our stock price would crater the moment news of these violations became public.
Investors would demand explanations, resignations, criminal prosecutions.
The financial markets hate uncertainty, and admitting to systematic environmental violations creates maximum uncertainty. The stock price is going to crater regardless, Sarah replied bluntly. The only question is whether it crashes because you voluntarily disclosed problems and implemented solutions, or because federal agents raided your facilities and arrested your executives.
Markets hate uncertainty, but they hate criminal prosecutions and bankruptcy even more.
She had researched similar cases extensively, studying how other companies had navigated environmental scandals. Companies that voluntarily disclosed violations and implemented comprehensive reforms typically saw their stock prices recover within 18 months. Companies that were caught and prosecuted typically saw their stock prices never recover, because the companies themselves ceased to exist. The financial argument was compelling, but it was also the easiest for the board members to understand. These were people who had spent their careers thinking in terms of quarterly results and annual profits. The idea that short-term financial pain might be necessary to ensure long-term survival was difficult but not incomprehensible. Henderson returned to his seat, looking older than he had when the meeting began.
If we agreed to your proposal, and I'm not saying we have, what would be your first priority?
Where would you start?
Sarah had prepared for this question as well.
Immediate cessation of all illegal activities, followed by comprehensive documentation of existing violations and their scope. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we can develop a realistic remediation plan. That means bringing in independent environmental consultants, conducting comprehensive health screenings for all employees, and securing the scene to prevent any additional violations while we work. She opened her laptop again and displayed a timeline she had developed. Week 1, cease all illegal activities and secure facilities.
Week 2, comprehensive environmental and health assessments.
Week 3, voluntary disclosure to regulatory authorities with preliminary findings. Week 4, implementation of immediate safety measures and beginning of long-term remediation planning. The timeline was aggressive but necessary. Every day of delay increased the risk that the violations would be discovered through other channels, and every day of continued illegal activity increased the eventual penalties and health consequences. This assumes full cooperation from current management and staff, Sarah continued. Any resistance or obstruction would slow the process and increase both legal and financial risks.
Which is why Mitchell's resignation is non-negotiable. His continued presence would signal to other employees that cooperation is optional rather than mandatory.
Chen studied the timeline carefully. 4 weeks from cessation to disclosure. That's not much time to prepare for regulatory investigations and media attention. It's enough time if we work efficiently, Sarah replied. The key is transparency and proactive communication. Regulatory agencies are more likely to work with companies that voluntarily disclose problems and demonstrate immediate corrective action. Media coverage is more likely to focus on solutions rather than scandals if we control the narrative through honest disclosure rather than reactive damage control. She had seen too many companies try to manage environmental scandals through PR campaigns and legal maneuvering. The approach rarely worked, and it often made the eventual consequences more severe when the truth finally emerged.
Margaret Whitfield was still studying the medical records. These workers who have been affected, what do we owe them? Financially, I mean, but also morally.
Comprehensive medical care for all work-related health issues, paid leave for recovery time, and compensation for medical expenses not covered by insurance, Sarah replied immediately. We also owe them the truth about what happened and our commitment to ensuring it never happens again. The moral debt was perhaps more significant than the financial one. Trust, once broken, was extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Workers who discovered that their employer had knowingly exposed them to dangerous chemicals would be rightfully skeptical of any promises about future safety measures. The cost of employee medical care and compensation could easily exceed $10 million, Henderson observed. The cost of not providing that care could exceed $100 million in lawsuits, Sarah replied. More importantly, taking care of affected employees is the right thing to do, which matters when you're trying to rebuild a company culture based on integrity and responsibility. The conversation had evolved from resistance to negotiation, from rejection to reluctant acceptance. Sarah could feel the shift in the room's energy as board members moved from protecting the status quo to managing the transition to something new. But the most difficult part was still ahead. Accepting her proposal meant accepting her leadership, and that meant acknowledging that everything they thought they knew about running their company had been wrong. It meant trusting their future to someone they had dismissed as unqualified, someone whose background and approach challenged every assumption they had made about corporate leadership. The file folder sat closed on the table, its work done. The information it contained had already changed everything. Now the only question was whether the people in the room had the courage to change with it. The vote was closer than Sarah had expected. 7 in favor, 5 opposed. Margaret Whitfield had surprised everyone by voting yes, her decision apparently swayed by the medical records of affected workers. Harrison Clark had surprised no one by voting no, his loyalty to family traditions outweighing practical considerations. The deciding vote had come from David Chen, who had studied the financial projections and concluded that Sarah's proposal offered the only realistic path to corporate survival. Henderson had abstained, claiming conflict of interest due to his family relationship with Thomas Mitchell. But his abstention was itself a form of consent. As chairman, he could have tabled the discussion or called for additional review. His decision to allow the vote to proceed signaled his recognition that the status quo was no longer sustainable. The motion passes, Henderson announced, his voice heavy with resignation and something that might have been relief. Sarah Martinez is hereby appointed Chief Technology Officer of Henderson Industries, with full authority to implement the environmental compliance and remediation program outlined in her proposal. The words felt surreal as they echoed through the boardroom. Sarah had prepared for this moment for weeks, but the reality of victory was more complex than she had anticipated. She felt triumph, yes, but also the crushing weight of responsibility for everything that would happen next. "Thank you," she said simply. "I won't let you down." As the board members filed out of the room, several stopped to shake her hand or offer congratulations that ranged from genuine to grimly resigned. Margaret Whitfield paused at the door. "Those medical records," she said quietly. "I have a granddaughter who works in manufacturing. Different company, but still, seeing those health problems, knowing they were preventable." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "Fix this, Sarah. Whatever it takes." The support was unexpected but welcome. Sarah would need allies in the difficult months ahead, and Margaret Whitfield's influence with other board members could prove crucial when the inevitable resistance to change emerged. Henderson was the last to leave, gathering his papers slowly as if postponing an inevitable confrontation. When they were alone, he looked up at Sarah with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of a few hours. "Tom Mitchell is waiting in my office," he said quietly. "He doesn't know what happened in this meeting, but he knows something has changed." "How do you want to handle his termination?" Sarah had given considerable thought to this moment. Mitchell's dismissal was necessary, but how it was handled would send a message to every other employee about the new direction of the company. "With respect and honesty," she replied. "He made poor decisions, but I don't think he's an evil person. He was trying to solve problems with the tools and authority he had available." The fact that those tools were inadequate and his authority was insufficient doesn't make his termination any less necessary, but it does mean we should handle it professionally.
Henderson nodded slowly.
He's going to ask about severance, about references, about his future.
What should I tell him?
Tell him that his cooperation with the environmental cleanup and regulatory investigations will determine how the company responds to those requests, Sarah said.
Full cooperation means generous severance and neutral references.
Obstruction or attempts to cover up additional violations means he's on his own with potential criminal charges. The balance between compassion and consequences was delicate, but it was essential for establishing the new culture Sarah intended to build. Accountability had to mean something, but it didn't have to mean cruelty. Henderson gathered his belongings and walked toward the door, then paused. Sarah, I want you to know that despite how this meeting went, I don't blame you for any of this.
You didn't create these problems. You just had the courage to expose them.
And the skills to fix them, Sarah added quietly.
Yes, Henderson agreed.
And the skills to fix them. I hope you're as good as you think you are, because if you're not, we're all going to prison. After Henderson left, Sarah remained alone in the boardroom, staring out at the city skyline as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference table. She had won, but victory felt more like the beginning of an enormous challenge than the end of a difficult journey. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister.
How did the meeting go? Are you the new CTO?
Sarah smiled and typed back, yes, but it's complicated. I'll call you tonight.
The response came immediately. Complicated good or complicated bad?
Complicated necessary, Sarah replied. Over the next hour, Sarah began the process of transforming from challenger to leader. Her first call was to Dr. Elizabeth Warren, an environmental consultant she had worked with during her previous position at Pacific Manufacturing. Warren specialized in emergency environmental response and had experience with voluntary disclosure cases. I need a team on site tomorrow morning, Sarah explained after outlining the situation. Comprehensive environmental assessment, immediate safety measures, and preparation for regulatory disclosure. Budget is not a constraint, but time is critical.
Warren's response was professional but concerned.
Sarah, what you're describing sounds like a multi-year cleanup project. Are you sure your board understands the scope of what they've committed to? They understand that the alternative is the complete destruction of the company, Sarah replied. Whether they fully grasp the scope of the solution is something we'll discover together. Her second call was to James Rodriguez, a labor attorney who specialized in occupational health cases. I need medical screening for approximately 400 employees, with particular attention to chemical exposure symptoms. I also need a protocol for managing workers' compensation claims that protects both employee rights and company interests. Rodriguez had worked with Sarah on workers' safety issues at her previous job, and he understood her approach to balancing employee protection with business necessity.
This is going to be expensive, Sarah.
Comprehensive medical screening, treatment for work-related health issues, and potential compensation claims could easily exceed $15 million. It's going to be more expensive if we don't do it right, Sarah replied. These workers trusted the company to keep them safe, and the company failed them. Now we have to prove that we're serious about rebuilding that trust. Her third call was to Michael Chen, David Chen's younger brother and a specialist in crisis communications. While she generally preferred transparency over spin, she recognized that how the story was told would significantly impact the company's ability to survive the disclosure process. The key is controlling the narrative through proactive communication rather than reactive damage control, Michael explained. If we announce voluntary disclosure and immediate remediation simultaneously, the story becomes about corporate responsibility and problem solving rather than just environmental crime and cover-up. I don't want spin, Sarah said firmly. I want honest communication that acknowledges what went wrong and demonstrates what we're doing to fix it. The moment we start trying to minimize or excuse what happened, we lose credibility with everyone who matters: regulators, employees, and the community. By 6 o'clock, Sarah had assembled her crisis response team and scheduled the first comprehensive site assessment for the following morning. She had also received confirmation that Thomas Mitchell's resignation had been submitted and accepted, though Henderson reported that the conversation had been difficult and emotionally charged. Thomas hurt and confused, Henderson explained during their brief phone conversation. He keeps saying he was trying to protect the company, that he was solving problems the way he'd been taught to solve them. I think he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He probably was doing what he thought was right, Sarah acknowledged. But intentions don't matter when people are getting sick and the environment is being damaged. The important thing now is whether he'll cooperate with cleanup efforts or whether he'll try to protect himself by blaming others. As Sarah finally left the Henderson Industries building that evening, she reflected on the surreal nature of the day. 12 hours earlier, she had been an unwanted job candidate facing certain rejection. Now she was the CTO of a major corporation, responsible for managing an environmental crisis that could determine the fate of thousands of jobs and the health of multiple communities. The security guard in the lobby nodded as she passed, apparently unaware that the woman walking out the door now held the future of his employer in her hands. The normalcy of the moment, commuters heading home, traffic flowing through downtown streets, restaurants preparing for the evening rush, felt strange against the backdrop of corporate upheaval and environmental emergency that now defined her world. Her phone rang as she reached her car. The caller ID showed her parents' number. "Mija, how did your meeting go?" her mother asked in the mixture of English and Spanish that had defined Sarah's childhood. "I got the job, Mama," Sarah said, leaning against her car as exhaustion finally began to catch up with her. "Que maravilloso. Your father and I are so proud. You worked so hard for this opportunity." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of expectation and responsibility. "The job comes with some challenges, Mama. The company has some problems that need to be fixed." "You'll fix them," her mother said with absolute confidence. "You always fix things. It's what you do." The simple faith in her voice was both comforting and terrifying. Her parents had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they had never had, working double shifts and saving every penny to pay for her education. They believed in the American dream with the fervor of people who had earned it through decades of hard work and determination. Now their daughter was about to risk everything, her career, her reputation, possibly her freedom, on a plan to save a company that had been systematically poisoning its workers and surrounding communities. The irony was not lost on her that the same immigrant work ethic her parents had instilled in her was now driving her to challenge the very systems that had excluded people like her family for generations. "I have to go, Mama," Sarah said. "I have a lot of work to do tonight." "Claro, Mija. But remember to eat something. You can't save the world on an empty stomach." Sarah smiled despite everything. Her mother's practical concerns remained unchanged regardless of corporate crises or environmental emergencies. Some things, at least, remained constant. As she drove home through the city streets, Sarah began mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. Tomorrow would bring environmental consultants, regulatory notifications, and the beginning of a cleanup process that would test every skill she had developed over her career. The easy part was over. Now she had to prove that she could deliver on the promises she had made in the boardroom. The file folder that had changed everything sat on her passenger seat, its contents now part of the official record of Henderson Industries. The evidence that had given her power was about to become the foundation for the most difficult project of her career. But, for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not because she fit into the existing culture of Henderson Industries, but because she was finally in a position to change that culture into something better. The woman who supposedly didn't belong was about to prove that belonging was never about fitting in, it was about having the courage to create something worth fitting into. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same boardroom where her life had changed forever, but everything else was different. The mahogany table still gleamed under the afternoon sun, but the faces around it reflected a transformation that went far deeper than corporate restructuring. Where there had once been skepticism and resistance, she now saw respect, collaboration, and something that looked remarkably like hope. The quarterly board meeting had just concluded with news that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Henderson Industries had not only survived the environmental disclosure and cleanup process, it was thriving. The company's voluntary cooperation with regulatory agencies had resulted in reduced penalties and expedited cleanup schedules. More importantly, the transparency and accountability measures Sarah had implemented had attracted new customers, talented employees, and even investor interest. The third quarter results are remarkable, David Chen reported, unable to hide his satisfaction as he reviewed the financial statements. Revenue is up 18% compared to the same period last year, employee satisfaction scores have improved by 40%, and our environmental compliance rating is now among the highest in the industry. Margaret Whitfield smiled as she added her own observations. The worker compensation program has processed 93 claims related to previous chemical exposure, with an average settlement of $47,000 per affected employee. More importantly, we haven't had a single new workplace injury related to chemical exposure since the safety protocols were implemented. The financial cost of the transformation had indeed been substantial. The final cleanup expenses had reached $34 million, slightly higher than Sarah's initial estimate but still within the range she had projected. Medical care and compensation for affected workers had added another $12 million. But these costs were already being offset by improved efficiency, reduced waste, lower insurance premiums, and the competitive advantages that came with genuine environmental leadership. Henderson sat at the head of the table, looking more relaxed than Sarah had ever seen him. The past 6 months had aged him, but they had also seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying. "I want to read something," he said, pulling out a letter. This came from Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Environmental Committee. She's asking Henderson Industries to testify before Congress about voluntary environmental compliance as a model for other companies. The request was both an honor and a validation of the path they had chosen. Rather than being investigated as environmental criminals, Henderson Industries was being invited to share its transformation as an example of corporate responsibility. The company that had once covered up violations was now being asked to teach other companies how to prevent them. "There's also this," Margaret Whitfield added, holding up a newspaper clipping. "The Wall Street Journal is calling our approach the Henderson model and suggesting it should become the industry standard for environmental compliance." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but also the familiar weight of responsibility. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought scrutiny. The company's transformation was being watched by competitors, regulators, environmental groups, and other corporations looking for guidance on how to manage similar challenges. "The real test," Sarah said quietly, "is whether we can maintain these standards over time. It's relatively easy to implement changes during a crisis when everyone is focused on survival. The harder challenge is embedding these practices so deeply in our culture that they persist even when the crisis is over and the immediate pressure is gone." This concern had kept her awake many nights over the past 6 months. Corporate culture change was notoriously difficult to sustain, and there was always the temptation to revert to old practices once immediate threats had passed. Sarah had seen too many companies implement reforms during crises only to gradually abandon them as memories faded and pressures mounted. "Which brings us to the succession planning discussion," Henderson said, his tone becoming more serious. "Sarah, you've exceeded every expectation we had when we appointed you to this position. But, more importantly, you've proven that the skills and perspective we initially saw as foreign to our corporate culture are actually essential for our future success." The transition had not been without challenges. Some employees had resented the new transparency requirements, viewing them as unnecessary bureaucracy rather than essential safeguards. A few managers had resigned rather than adapt to accountability measures that made cover-ups impossible. Some customers had initially been concerned about doing business with a company that had disclosed environmental violations, though most had eventually been impressed by the proactive approach to fixing the problems. "The question," Henderson continued, "is how to ensure that the transformation you've led becomes permanent rather than temporary. How do we make sure that future leaders maintain the standards you've established?" It was a crucial question, and one that Sarah had been thinking about extensively. Personal leadership could create change, but only systemic reform could sustain it. The company needed structures, processes, and incentives that made ethical behavior the natural choice rather than the difficult choice. "We need to institutionalize accountability," Sarah replied.
independent oversight, transparent reporting, and consequences that are automatic rather than discretionary.
The moment environmental compliance or worker safety becomes a matter of individual judgment rather than systematic requirement, we risk returning to the problems that brought us to crisis in the first place. She had spent considerable time studying companies that had successfully transformed their cultures and those that had failed to sustain reforms. The difference was usually whether changes were embedded in formal systems or dependent on particular individuals. Personal leadership could initiate transformation, but only structural reform could maintain it.
David Chen leaned forward with interest. What would that look like in practical terms?
Sarah opened her laptop and displayed a presentation she had been developing. Independent environmental audits conducted quarterly by external consultants, with results published immediately on the company website. Worker safety committees with real authority to shut down operations if violations are detected.
Automatic penalties for managers who fail to report safety concerns or environmental issues. Executive compensation tied directly to compliance metrics rather than just financial performance.
The proposal was comprehensive, but it was also controversial. Some board members were uncomfortable with the level of external oversight and transparency Sarah was suggesting.
There was still a lingering preference for managing problems internally rather than exposing them to public scrutiny.
The board would essentially be giving up significant control over how compliance issues are handled, Harrison Clark observed, his tone suggesting skepticism about the wisdom of such an approach. The board would be exchanging the illusion of control for the reality of sustainable success, Sarah corrected. The control you're worried about losing is the same control that allowed the previous problems to develop and persist undetected.
Real control comes from building systems that prevent problems rather than systems that hide them. Margaret Whitfield nodded thoughtfully.
It's like the difference between controlling a car by steering versus controlling it by covering the speedometer.
One approach actually influences where you're going, the other just changes what you see.
The analogy was apt, and it seemed to resonate with several board members who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's transparency-focused approach. Over the past 6 months, they had learned that knowing about problems was almost always preferable to not knowing about them, even when the knowledge was uncomfortable. There's another aspect to sustainability that we haven't discussed, Sarah continued. Leadership development and succession planning. The transformation we've achieved was possible partly because I came from outside the existing culture and had no investment in maintaining systems that weren't working.
But long-term success requires developing leaders from within who are committed to the new approach.
She clicked to the next slide, showing an organizational chart that highlighted high-potential employees who had embraced the cultural changes and demonstrated both technical competence and ethical leadership. Maria Santos in environmental compliance, James Wilson in worker safety, and Patricia Kim in operational efficiency have all shown exceptional leadership during the transition. They understand both the technical requirements and the cultural changes necessary to maintain our standards. They should be developed as potential successors not just to my position, but to key leadership roles throughout the company. The succession planning conversation was delicate because it touched on long-standing assumptions about how leadership positions were filled at Henderson Industries. Historically, senior roles had often gone to family members, long-term employees, or external hires with impressive pedigrees. Sarah was suggesting that competence and commitment to the company's new values should be the primary criteria, regardless of background or connections.
Henderson studied the organizational chart carefully.
These are all relatively young employees, and none of them come from traditional management backgrounds.
Neither did I, Sarah replied with a slight smile. And I seem to have worked out reasonably well.
The gentle reminder drew chuckles from around the table, but it also made a serious point. The qualities that had made Sarah effective: outsider perspective, technical expertise, moral courage, and willingness to challenge established practices were not typically found among traditional corporate leaders. Building a sustainable culture required identifying and developing people with similar qualities, regardless of whether they fit conventional expectations. I'd like to propose a formal leadership development program, Sarah continued, focused specifically on building the skills and perspectives necessary to maintain the environmental and ethical standards we've established. Participants would work directly with external consultants, regulatory agencies, and community groups to understand the full scope of our responsibilities and the consequences of failing to meet them. The program was ambitious, but it addressed a fundamental challenge that many companies faced when trying to maintain cultural changes over time. Without deliberate development of leaders who understood and were committed to the new approach, organizations tended to drift back toward previous practices as institutional memory faded and external pressures mounted.
David Chen was intrigued by the proposal. How would participants be selected for this program?
Based on demonstrated commitment to the new values during the transition, technical competence in their current roles, and potential for increased responsibility, Sarah replied. But also based on their ability to challenge authority when necessary and to prioritize long-term success over short-term convenience. These are not qualities that show up in traditional performance evaluations, but they're essential for maintaining the culture we've built. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from specific implementation details to broader questions about corporate governance and social responsibility. By the end of the meeting, the board had approved Sarah's succession planning proposal and agreed to implement the enhanced oversight measures she had recommended. As the meeting concluded and board members began filing out, Henderson approached Sarah with an expression that mixed pride, gratitude, and something that might have been wonder. "A year ago, I thought you were a threat to everything this company represented," he said quietly.
"Now I realize you were the only person who could save everything this company should represent." Sarah felt a surge of emotion that she quickly controlled.
The company you inherited had lost its way, but the vision your great-grandfather had when he started Henderson Industries, building something that serves both profit and purpose, that vision was worth saving.
It just needed people who were willing to fight for it.
As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave the boardroom, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who supposedly didn't belong had not only found her place, she had helped create a place worth belonging to. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister, saw the Wall Street Journal article about the Henderson model.
"Mom is framing it for the wall.
Dad says he's proud but not surprised, he always knew his daughter could change the world."
Sarah smiled as she typed back, "One company at a time." The response came immediately, "What's next?"
Sarah looked out the window at the city below, where other companies faced similar challenges and other leaders struggled with similar decisions. The file folder that had started everything was now part of a case study being taught in business schools across the country.
The woman who didn't belong had become a model for how outsiders could transform organizations from within.
"There's a lot of work still to do," she typed back. "But, for the first time in my career, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be."
As Sarah left the Henderson Industries building that evening, she noticed something different about the security guard's greeting.
There was respect in his eyes now, but also something more, the recognition that the person passing through the lobby was someone who had proven that belonging wasn't about fitting into existing spaces, but about having the courage to create better spaces for everyone. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Because true change wasn't about fixing one company or solving one crisis, it was about proving that different approaches could work, that outsider perspectives were valuable, and that the future belonged to organizations willing to embrace both excellence and inclusion. Sarah Martinez had stopped trying to belong in other people's worlds. Instead, she had built a world worth belonging to, and, in doing so, she had changed not just Henderson Industries, but the very definition of what corporate leadership could look like in the 21st century.